In the blistering heat of the desert, a man stands beside the horse he is about to bury. But its eyes, they don't just look at him, they seem to open a door to a dark past he's tried to bury his entire life. Will its death be the key to freeing him from unforgivable sins, or is it the beginning of a journey he can no longer escape? A journey that will cost him dearly in blood? With every passing second, a secret begins to unravel, and that horse may be the only thing that can pull him from the depths of his own darkness. This story is just beginning. Unspoken secrets, unpredictable twists. Join us as we step into this journey, where truth and guilt intertwine, and no one can escape their past. The scorching sun of the Arizona desert struck the vast, silent space like 1,000 sharp blades. The dry wind carried no signs of life, only dust swirling up like silent waves, spreading across every corner of the desert. In that endless silence, a man stood alone, gripping a shovel, his face marked with the scars of battles he had fought, not just in war, but in life. Beside him, the horse stood tall, its dark eyes staring directly at him. It wasn't just the gaze of a wild horse, it was a look that seemed to pierce through the darkest corners of his soul. He couldn't tear his eyes away from those eyes. They were like invisible blades, cutting deep into his heart, awakening memories he had spent years trying to bury. Those eyes, deep and full of understanding, seemed to know everything about his past, about the sins he could never wash away. He bent down, ready to do what he thought was necessary, to bury this horse, to end something he couldn't face. But just then, in that moment, the horse lifted its head, its eyes glowing with an eerie light. He felt a cold shiver run through him, as if this horse was challenging him, as if it was demanding that he face the truth he had avoided his whole life. Drops of sweat ran down his forehead, his hands trembling. He couldn't understand why this horse made him feel this way. One look from it, and suddenly, everything became unclear. Would its death finally end the painful past he carried, or was this just the beginning of a journey he couldn't escape? And in that moment, John realized that, whether he wanted to or not, he could no longer run from his past. John Whitmore, a man whose exterior was as hard as stone, hid a heart full of scars. His life, ever since the war had ended, was one of solitude, with no family, no close friends. He returned from the battlefield with a soul worn out, and wounds that would never heal. After the war, he came back alone, to a vast ranch that echoed with emptiness. Each day dragged on in suffocating silence, without anyone to share it, no one to offer a word of encouragement. He existed behind four walls of memory, where the past returned like a ghost that would never leave. All the pain in John's soul stemmed from a single event, one that had happened years ago, the disappearance of Aaron, his beloved younger brother. A fight had broken out between the two, no words of reconciliation, only shouts and silence that followed. Aaron left in a fit of rage and never came back. John had always felt guilty, blaming himself for not stopping the argument, wondering if there was something else he could have done to keep Aaron from leaving, to prevent that painful parting. If I had said something different, if I hadn't given up, would Aaron still be here? These questions haunted John every time he was alone. He couldn't bear the feeling that he had failed, that he had lost the only brother he had. The guilt never left him, following him like a shadow he couldn't escape. His relationship with his father wasn't any better. John's father, a man of stern discipline and coldness, never showed affection, never offered praise. Their arguments had dragged on for years. John never felt accepted, always feeling unworthy of his father's love. His father kept a distance, making John feel as if he had never truly been the son his father loved. And now, the appearance of Aries was like a shock to the buried memories within John. The horse's eyes, full of understanding and calm, gazed at him as if looking into his very soul. A strange feeling swelled within him. Why does this horse have such a knowing look? It knows something I'm not ready to face." John couldn't explain what he felt. Aries wasn't just a wild Mustang. It was like a piece of his past that he had thrown away, but now it had returned, reminding him of the wounds that had never healed, of the loneliness and guilt he carried within. The presence of Aries forced John to remember Aaron and to feel that he had abandoned his brother. In the eyes of the horse, he saw the reflection of himself, the one who left behind the past, the one who left broken relationships, the one who left a shattered family. He began to feel an odd connection to Aries, as though the horse knew the pain he had been carrying better than anyone else. Aries wasn't just a wild creature, it was a silent companion, a wordless partner who understood him more than anyone. As the days passed, John couldn't avoid facing himself. Can I keep living like this? Have I lost everything that truly mattered? But Aries was there, a reminder he couldn't avoid. He couldn't forget, couldn't run away. The feelings of guilt, the lack of love from his father, and the pain of losing Aaron swirled in John's mind. He knew that to find peace in his soul, he would have to face the painful past. And Aries, the horse that was not merely a wild creature, might be the only key to unlocking the door that had been closed in his mind for so long. And as Aries' gaze bored deeper into his soul, John realized the moment had arrived, the moment he could no longer run from the truth. The past had returned, and there was no avoiding the reckoning that lay ahead. The desert air, dry and unrelenting, seemed to thicken as John stood there, his hand still resting gently on Aries' neck. The Mustang's dark eyes, filled with a knowing calmness, never left his. It was as if the horse, this wild creature of the desert, was more than just an animal. It was a presence, a force that seemed to pull John back into a past he had spent so many years trying to bury. Aries wasn't simply a horse, it was a symbol, a living, breathing reminder of everything John had suppressed. The white mark on Aries' forehead, the exact same shape as the scar that Aaron had once worn, stared back at him with an intensity that sent a chill down his spine. No, John thought, his breath catching in his throat. It can't be, but it is. That mark, that sign, could not be ignored any longer. It was too familiar. It was Aaron, the brother who had disappeared all those years ago. The realization hit John like a wave, one that threatened to overwhelm him. He had thought that Aaron's disappearance was just a tragic chapter, left unfinished, but now, as Aries stood before him, he began to wonder if it was something far more profound. Could the horse be a part of something larger? Was it the key to unlocking the truth of what had really happened to his brother? The bond between them was not merely coincidental. Aries had come for a reason John was too afraid to confront. As he looked into Aries' eyes, John was no longer just staring at a wild animal. He was staring into the abyss of his own fears, his own guilt. Aries was not merely an animal of the desert. It was a guide, a creature brought into his life for a purpose that he could no longer ignore. It was as if the horse, with its piercing gaze, was asking him to finally face what he had been running from for so long. The air seemed heavier now, charged with an energy that John couldn't explain. The connection between him and Aries deepened, pulling at something buried deep within him. He had been avoiding it for so long, the past, the truth about Aaron, the secrets he had buried under the weight of time. But now, there was no turning back. The past had arrived in the form of Aries, and it was demanding to be heard. John's heart pounded in his chest as his fingers trembled on the Mustang's mane. The soft wind rustled through the desert, carrying with it whispers from the past, urging him forward. He could no longer deny the connection that had been established, not just between him and the horse, but between him and everything he had hidden away. "I can't bury you," John whispered, his voice barely audible against the quiet expanse of the desert. "Not now, not ever." The decision came as a relief, yet it was also a terrifying realization. By choosing to confront Aries, he was choosing to confront everything: the pain, the loss, the anger, the guilt, everything he had buried in his soul for years. As Aries stood motionless, the Mustang's presence seemed to echo in John's heart, filling him with an unfamiliar sense of purpose. He had spent years suppressing his emotions, hiding from the truth, but now Aries had come to force him to face what he had tried to avoid. With a deep breath, John stepped back and surveyed the vast emptiness of the desert. Aries had not just appeared by chance. It had come to guide him, to show him the way forward, but also to unravel the truths that lay in the past. John understood now that he had no choice but to follow, no matter how painful the journey ahead might be. The past had returned, and it was time to face it. The truth that had been hidden for so long was no longer just a shadow in his mind. It was alive, breathing, and standing in front of him. "This isn't just about you, Aries," John murmured, more to himself than to the horse. "This is about everything I've been running from." The desert was vast and unforgiving, yet in that moment, it felt as though the air had shifted. Aries, with its wild eyes and unyielding presence, had become more than just a horse. It was a living testament to everything John had ignored, to everything he had failed to confront. The Mustang was not just an animal, it was a force of nature, a force that had come to demand the truth. John knew the journey ahead would not be easy. He would have to face the painful memories of his brother, the unresolved questions about his family, and the guilt that had haunted him for so long. But Aries, in its silent, powerful way, had shown him that the only way forward was through. There would be no more burying the past. The truth, no matter how painful, had to be uncovered. And as Aries' gaze seemed to pierce through his very soul, John knew that his path forward was no longer a choice. The past, the truth, and the responsibility he had buried for so long were now impossible to ignore. The time had come to uncover what had been hidden for too long. The room was heavy with the scent of old wood and dust, the air thick with the weight of years spent locked away in silence. John sat hunched over in the dim glow of a single lamp, the flicker of its light casting long shadows against the walls. His fingers trembled as they turned the brittle pages of Aaron's journal, each page thick with words that felt heavier than stone. The wind outside howled softly, the faint sound of Aries' hooves against the earth a constant reminder that the truth was waiting to be uncovered. John had pored over the journal for days, reading every word with a mixture of disbelief and dread. The deeper he read, the more he realized that Aaron hadn't left out of anger or petty frustration. No, the truth was far darker, something that had been hidden from him for too long. It wasn't a mere family dispute, it was a fight for survival, for truth, for freedom. Aaron's journal had opened a door John didn't even know existed. His brother had chronicled everything: their father's greed, his cruelty, the ruthless land deals that destroyed countless lives in their wake. John had always known his father to be stern, cold, and distant, but never had he imagined the depths of the man's depravity. The ranch, the wealth, the empire they had built, it had come at a terrible price. Aaron had written, "He's a monster. He'll burn everything to the ground just to keep his hold on this land. I can't let him destroy us anymore. I have to leave. I have to protect the ones I love from him." The realization hit John like a physical blow. His father, the man who had raised him, the man whose approval he had always craved, was nothing but a tyrant. And Aaron, in his quiet rebellion, had been the only one brave enough to see it. Aaron hadn't left because he was angry, he had left because he had uncovered the truth, the devastating truth about their father's actions, actions that threatened to destroy the very fabric of their family. John's heart squeezed with shame as he read the final entry in Aaron's journal. "I'm leaving. I know what I'm doing is right, but it's tearing me apart. I can't live under his roof, not anymore. I can't be a part of this. maybe someday you'll understand." The words were raw with pain, drenched in sorrow, and yet full of a resolution that John had never known his brother to possess. As the weight of the revelation settled over him, John's hands shook harder, the journal slipping from his grip. His breath came in short, shallow gasps. All these years, he had thought Aaron's departure was a result of a heated argument, of a simple misunderstanding between brothers. But it had been far more than that. Aaron had left to save them, to protect them from their father's darkness. And John had never known, never understood why Aaron had done it. The pain of it crashed into him like a tidal wave. "I failed you, Aaron," John whispered, his voice thick with grief. "I didn't see it. I didn't understand." Just as John was about to close the journal, he noticed something odd, a passing mention that stopped his breath. His eyes skimmed the page again. "I'm taking Whisper with me. It's the only thing that'll keep me grounded. He's the only one who understands what I'm going through." John's breath hitched. Whisper? The name echoed in his mind like a warning bell. He read it again, more carefully this time, his heart beginning to race. Whisper. Aries. A flood of realization crashed down on him. Aries. The Mustang standing outside, the same one that had returned to him, was the very horse Aaron had ridden all those years ago. The very horse that had disappeared with Aaron, vanishing into the desert, just as his brother had. John stood up, his legs weak beneath him, as the gravity of the moment hit him. It's him. It's the same horse. His voice cracked. Aries, the wild stallion, had been with Aaron in his final days, helping him escape their father's suffocating grip. Aries had been more than just an animal. He had been a partner in Aaron's quiet rebellion, a silent witness to the dark truths that had torn their family apart. A storm of emotions surged through John, guilt, anger, sorrow, but most of all, a deep, aching regret. Aries wasn't just a living reminder of the past, it was a bridge to the truth he had been running from for so long. The Mustang had returned, not just to him, but to make sure John would finally understand. The horse had been with Aaron through it all. It had seen the dark, dangerous side of their father, and it had seen John's failure to protect his brother from it. Now, it was back to force John to face the full weight of his responsibility. Aries, you've come back. But why? Why now? John whispered, staring out the window at the horse standing in the distance, its eyes locked onto his with an almost knowing gaze. It was clear now. The horse hadn't returned just to remind him of Aaron. Aries had come to push him into the truth, to make him confront everything he had tried to bury. You've come back to show me that running from the past isn't an option anymore, John murmured. I've been hiding from this for too long. The Mustang wasn't just a symbol of the past, John realized. It was an embodiment of his failure, a constant reminder of the guilt he had carried for not understanding Aaron, for not being there when his brother needed him most. Aries was the key to unlocking the painful truth, and now it was John's turn to confront the reality of everything he had ignored for so long. As the room seemed to close in around him, John finally understood. The past, with all its pain and regret, had returned, and it was time for him to face it. The guilt of not being there for Aaron, the truth about their father, and the weight of responsibility that John had long ignored, all of it was now here, embodied in Aries. With a deep, steadying breath, John wiped the tears from his eyes and whispered, I'm ready now. He stood up, the journal still in his hand, and walked toward the door. Outside, Aries was waiting, as if it knew the journey they were about to take, a journey into the past, a journey toward redemption, a journey toward the truth. But just as the pieces of the past began to fall into place, John realized that the truth was not yet fully revealed. There was one more piece, one that would change everything. It was time for him to meet the daughter of the man he had failed to protect, and in her eyes, he would see more than just a reflection of his brother's choices. He would see a future they both needed to face. As the sun dipped lower behind the distant mountains, casting long, slanted shadows over the desert, John felt the weight of the past press down on him like never before. His mind was still reeling from the revelations of Aaron's journal, the cruel truth about their father, the painful realization of his own failures. But now, as the cold winds began to sweep across the land, there was something else that he hadn't expected: Lena. She stood in the doorway of the old ranch house, her silhouette framed by the fading light. Lena was a stranger, yet not. She was his brother's daughter, but she was also someone he had never known, never imagined. The girl who had grown up in the shadows of the very man who had torn their family apart. The girl who had carried the weight of Aaron's sacrifice, a sacrifice that had cost her, too. John studied her for a long moment. Lena was everything he hadn't expected. She had her father's strength, his fierce independence, but there was something else, a quiet sorrow in her eyes, a pain that mirrored his own. She had been living with the same ghosts, the same unanswered questions that John had carried for years. And now, she was standing before him, a reminder of the life Aaron had tried to protect, and the life that John had failed to understand. "You're the one who found the journal," Lena said, her voice low but steady, cutting through the silence between them. "I should have known you'd be the one to dig up the past." Her words were sharp, but there was a truth in them, a recognition of the inevitable. John had been hiding from the past, running from the truth. But now, Lena was here, standing as a living, breathing reminder of everything he had ignored. The weight of his guilt felt heavier with every passing second. "I didn't ask for this," John muttered, his voice tinged with frustration. "But the past doesn't leave us, does it? It just keeps coming back, like it always has." Lena's eyes softened for a moment, and John saw the weariness beneath her tough exterior. "No, it doesn't," she agreed quietly. "But sometimes, it's not about running from it. It's about finding a way to live with it." The conversation between them had only just begun, but already, John could feel the divide between them. Lena's relationship with Aaron, her understanding of his departure, was so different from his own. While John had spent years carrying the guilt of Aaron's leaving, Lena had grown up believing in her father's choices, had lived with the understanding that his departure was necessary. To her, it wasn't a betrayal, it was a sacrifice. But to John, it was a mistake, a failure of understanding that he couldn't undo. As they continued to talk, the tension between them only deepened. Lena didn't understand why John felt so guilty, why he couldn't just accept that Aaron had made the decision he thought was right. "You don't get it," she said, her voice rising with emotion. "You weren't there. You didn't see what he went through. You didn't see the price he paid." John stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. "I didn't see," he echoed, his voice thick with regret. "But I should have. I should have been there. I should have known." Lena's eyes darkened, the raw anger that had been simmering beneath her calm surface now breaking through. "You weren't there, and you don't get to judge him for it," she snapped. "You don't get to decide what was right or wrong. He did what he had to do to protect us. And you abandoned him." The words cut deep. John recoiled from the force of them, feeling the sting of their truth. He had abandoned Aaron. He had failed to see the reasons behind his brother's decisions. And now, standing here, Lena was forcing him to confront that failure in a way that he never could have prepared for. But even as the words stung, John couldn't help but feel the raw, unspoken truth in Lena's anger. She had grown up with Aaron's decisions, had lived through the quiet pain of those choices, and in some ways, she had accepted them. But John had spent years denying them, running from the truth, burying the guilt. Lena wasn't the only one with hidden wounds, John realized. She wasn't the only one carrying the weight of their family's history. And in that moment, John realized that the pain of the past wasn't something that could be erased or forgotten. It had to be faced, just as Lena was facing it now. But there was still more to uncover, more than either of them had realized. As the conversation between John and Lena unfolded, it became clear that the story of Aaron's choices, of their father's sins, was far from over. And there was still one more truth that would bind them together, one more revelation that would force them both to see the full scope of what their family had become. As the wind of understanding began to sweep through John and Lena's fragile connection, John realized that the real battle was not between them, it was within himself. The truth was no longer a weight to carry but a burden to face. And in the silent presence of Aries, he saw the way forward. The path to redemption would not only require him to confront the past, but also to choose who he wanted to be in the future. John stood at the edge of the land, his eyes tracing the rolling hills that stretched endlessly before him. The winds had shifted, carrying with them a sense of change, a sense of possibility. Yet, despite the beauty of the desert, a quiet storm brewed inside him. He had never realized how much he had been running, from the past, from the pain, from the guilt. But now, standing alone with only Aries by his side, the journey he had been avoiding was finally at hand. "What have I done?" John muttered to himself, his voice tinged with regret. The thought had been echoing in his mind for days now, ever since he had uncovered the full truth about Aaron's departure. It had been so easy to place the blame on his brother, to assume that Aaron had abandoned him out of anger, out of rebellion. But now, John understood, Aaron had left to protect them, to protect the family from the toxic darkness that their father had spread across their lives. And John, in his anger, had failed to see it. But it wasn't just about Aaron anymore. It was about everything he had done, or rather, everything he had failed to do. John had built walls around himself, had lived a life of denial, never fully accepting the responsibility for the fractured relationships in his life. He had blamed others, blamed circumstances, but never himself. It was easier that way. Easier to hide behind his pride, easier to stay in the shadows of his own guilt rather than step into the light. Now, that light was flickering before him. It wasn't about Aaron anymore, or their father. It was about John, the man he had become and the man he could still be. As Aries shifted beside him, John's gaze turned to the horse. The Mustang had stood by him through all of this, unwavering. It was more than just a reminder of the past. It was a symbol of resilience, of strength. Aries had been with Aaron during his darkest days, and now it was here with John, helping him face his own darkness. For the first time, John understood the true connection between man and horse. It wasn't just a partnership, it was a bond that transcended words, that reached deep into the soul. "I've wasted so much time," John whispered, looking down at the Mustang. "But it's not too late. I can still change. I have to change." John felt a stirring deep within him, a shift in his very core. It wasn't just a moment of realization, it was the beginning of something much deeper. The guilt, which had once consumed him, no longer felt like a burden. It was a part of him, yes, but it was no longer the only part. He could no longer run from it. He had to face it. And that meant facing himself. He couldn't change the past. He couldn't undo the years of silence, the missed opportunities, the broken relationships. But he could change what came next. As the days passed, John began to understand that forgiveness wasn't just about asking for it from others, it was about giving it to himself. He had spent so long carrying the weight of guilt, but the only way to truly move forward was to let go of it, to accept that he had made mistakes, but those mistakes didn't define him. His journey with Aries, the Mustang that had carried him through the storm, had shown him that redemption wasn't a distant goal. It was a choice to embrace his imperfections and move forward with purpose. But this process wasn't without its challenges. John had always been a man of pride, of hard work, but now he had to reckon with his own humanity, his own vulnerability. What if it's too late, he wondered. What if he couldn't undo the damage he had caused? What if Lena never forgave him for the years he had spent in denial, for not being there when she needed him? These thoughts gnawed at him, but with each passing day, they grew weaker. He was no longer defined by his past mistakes, he was defining his future. But the real test was still ahead. The winds had shifted again, and this time, it wasn't just about John. It was about his choices moving forward. A message came to John, a message that would change everything. His land, the sanctuary he had worked so hard to protect, was at risk. There was talk of developers moving in, of the wild horses being pushed out. John knew he couldn't let this happen. This was his chance to make things right, to not only protect the land but to finally step up and be the man he had always wanted to be. "This is it," John said, his voice steady for the first time in years. "I won't hide anymore." But the decision wasn't simple. He could protect the land, protect the Mustangs, but at what cost? Was it worth sacrificing everything he had built? Was he willing to expose the secrets that had kept him hidden for so long? The choice was difficult, and for a moment, John hesitated. Lena, who had been standing quietly nearby, approached him. "You know what you have to do, don't you?" she said softly, her voice filled with both understanding and challenge. "It's not just about protecting the land or the horses. It's about protecting what's left of us, what's left of our family." John looked into her eyes, and for the first time, he saw her clearly. She wasn't just the daughter of Aaron. She was a reflection of everything he had failed to protect, and now they both had the opportunity to make things right. "I'm ready," John said, his voice firm. "We'll protect this land. We'll protect the Mustangs. And we'll make sure our past isn't the thing that defines us." As John stood at the edge of the vast, open land, he felt the weight of the past finally lift. He had walked through the storm, and now, in the quiet calm that followed, he was ready for the future, a future he would create, not escape from. The sun was setting low over the desert, casting long shadows across the land. John, Lena, and Aries stood side by side on the open plains, gazing out at the Mustangs running free. The sight was beautiful, untamed, and in it, John saw the reflection of his own soul, wild, unburdened, and finally at peace. This was not just about protecting the land or the wild horses. This was about finding freedom within himself. The Mustangs, once symbols of captivity, were now symbols of freedom, not only for them but for John and Lena, who had learned to free themselves from the chains of guilt, anger, and regret. In protecting the Mustangs and the land, they had found something far greater, redemption, not just for the land, but for their own hearts. John looked over at Lena, her eyes soft, her expression a quiet understanding. They had both come so far, but there was still much more ahead. The journey they had begun, together and alone, was not over. It was only just beginning. "We did it," Lena said, her voice carrying the weight of a lifetime's worth of struggles and newfound peace. John nodded, his throat tight. He had spent so many years running from the truth, but here, in the open air, surrounded by the freedom of the wild horses, he understood he could not change the past, but he could choose what came next. The Mustangs ran in the distance, their powerful strides carrying them across the open fields, their manes flowing in the wind. And in that moment, John felt the freedom that they represented deep in his heart. He had healed. He had found peace. And now, like the wild horses, he was free. As the story comes to a poignant close, it becomes undeniably clear: love is not a way to escape the past, but an act of courage to embrace it, to learn from it, and ultimately to choose a new path forward. John's journey was not just about protecting the wild Mustangs or mending fractured family ties. It was about reclaiming a sense of peace within his soul, a peace that did not come from forgetting, but from acknowledging and healing his wounds. His journey was one of acceptance, understanding, and most profoundly, forgiveness, the strength to forgive others and, more importantly, the ability to forgive himself. The wild Mustangs, once symbols of captivity, have now become symbols of freedom, not only for the wild creatures they represent but also for John and Lena, who have learned how to free themselves from the suffocating chains of guilt, anger, and regret. By protecting the land and its creatures, they found the key to their own salvation. Through their actions, they not only safeguarded the future of the Mustangs but also rediscovered a future for themselves, a future rooted in renewal, with the shared hope that we can always begin again, no matter the darkness we carry with us. The wide open fields, the wind blowing through the Mustang's manes, and the silent understanding between John and Lena reinforced the story with a profound promise: healing, redemption, and peace are not destinations, but ongoing journeys. There will always be moments when the road ahead feels uncertain, when the weight of the past threatens to pull us back. But it is not the obstacles that define us. It is the choices we make in those moments, the strength to move forward, to embrace our truth, and to open our hearts to forgiveness, that will shape the paths we walk and, in turn, define the people we become. Forgiveness is not an ending, but a new beginning, not just for each of us, but for everything we choose to protect and cherish. Forgiveness is not merely about letting go of the past, but the strength to rebuild and renew relationships, hopes, and the very path we walk.